Diana, Princess of Wales, has died after a car crash in Paris.
The accident happened shortly after midnight.
They were apparently being pursued by paparazzi.
The car is still in the tunnel where it crashed.
It was the perfect storm. A lot of things were in play that night.
A shocking revelation from the police chief involved in the investigation into Princess Diana's final night has reignited questions about what really happened inside that Paris tunnel. For years, the tragedy has raised questions about Henri Paul.
Circumstantial evidence at least that the driver lost control while driving at very high speed.
The intense paparazzi chase.
Photographers who specialise in following celebrities and who on this occasion were chasing the couple on motorbikes.
Diana's earlier safety concerns.
She was religious in putting on her seatbelt. Why didn't she put it on that night?
And the events that unfolded before the fatal crash.
Back of the hotel to leave to go to Dodi's apartment. They have no idea that minutes later, of course, they're going to be dead.
While official investigations reached their conclusions, doubts and unanswered questions continued to haunt the public.
On the evidence available now, there was no conspiracy to murder any occupants of that car.
But what exactly did the police chief reveal? And could his findings finally change how we understand that heartbreaking night? So, what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. To help us create more videos and uncover the latest royal story, please subscribe. The findings that raised more questions. So, this is where the entire story begins. For years, Princess Diana's death remained one of the most painful and debated tragedies in modern history. The shock never completely faded, and neither did the questions. People wanted to know what happened during those final hours in Paris, whether the crash was simply a terrible accident, and whether there was anything hidden beneath the official explanation. That was where Lord Stevens entered the picture. As one of Britain's most senior police officers, Stevens was given the difficult task of leading a major investigation known as Operation Paget. His responsibility was not to follow public speculation or accept the most popular theory. He had to examine the evidence and determine what could actually be supported. Investigators looked closely at Henri Paul, the driver of the Mercedes.
Paris prosecutor's office disclosed today that the driver of the car in which Princess Diana was fatally injured had an illegal blood alcohol level.
They examined his movements, his condition, and the evidence suggesting his actions that night. They also investigated the paparazzi who followed Diana and Dodi, the possibility that another vehicle had been involved, and the claims that the crash had been deliberately arranged. The investigation became enormous because the questions surrounding Diana's death were enormous. Eventually, Stevens reached a conclusion that disappointed those who believed something more sinister had happened. His investigation found no evidence of a planned assassination and no proof of a conspiracy to kill Diana and Dodi. But that conclusion did not make every question disappear. In fact, for many people, it only shifted the focus. If there had been no secret plan, then what exactly caused everything to go so terribly wrong? Why was Henri Paul driving the Mercedes that night? Why were photographers chasing the couple? What happened during the hours before they left the Ritz? And what about the mysterious details surrounding the crash itself? The answers were buried somewhere between the final footage at the hotel and the twisted remains of the Mercedes inside the Alma tunnel, and investigators would have to go back through Diana's final hours, piece by piece, to find them. It was difficult to accept the head of police's report that there was no conspiracy behind Diana's death. But why was it so difficult? Could there have been a warning that something terrible might happen to Diana before her death? And who did she confide in about her fears? Let's uncover the shocking details. Diana's earlier fears about safety. Now, this is where the story becomes personal. Long before Princess Diana's final journey through Paris, there were already signs that something had been troubling her. In 1995, Diana reportedly told her lawyer, Lord Mishcon, that she did not feel completely safe. She wanted stronger protection around her car and greater security around her movements. More importantly, she described a feeling that something was not right. Those words were difficult to ignore. People close to Diana struggled to understand what she meant, while Mishcon later admitted he was unsure how seriously to take her concerns. Diana was facing immense personal pressure, making her genuine fears difficult to separate from everything else happening around her. Still, Mishcon did not dismiss what she had told him. He reportedly contacted Commander Jeffson to get another opinion. The response was significant. Jeffson said he believed Diana to some extent. That did not prove that Diana knew something terrible was coming, but it showed that her concerns had been serious enough for the people around her to remember them years later. And there was another important part of Diana's life that should not be overlooked. Despite the intense media attention surrounding her marriage, her separation from Charles, and constant speculation about her mental state, those who worked closely with her often described someone who was trying to move forward. She continued attending charity events, meeting people, helping causes she cared about, and finding moments to laugh despite everything happening around her. By 1997, Diana appeared to be entering a different chapter of her life. She had stepped further away from the restrictions of royal life, spent precious time with her sons, and seemed increasingly comfortable creating a future on her own terms. Then came Dodi Al-Fayed. Their relationship quickly attracted attention, but photographs from that summer showed Diana smiling, relaxing, and appearing happier than she had been in years. For a woman who had once spoken about feeling unsafe, it seemed as though life was finally beginning to settle. Aside from Diana confiding in her lawyer about fears for her safety, what else happened before her final night? And could that earlier event reveal something important about what happened later that night? Let's uncover the intriguing details. The moment the initial plan changed, but this is where the final night began to take a very different turn. Diana, Dodi Al-Fayed, and Trevor Rees-Jones arrived in Paris after spending time in the south of France. On the surface, it looked like another private trip, but photographers were already following their movements, and the intense attention surrounding the couple had followed them all the way into the city. When they returned to the Ritz Hotel, Henri Paul became central to everything that happened next. Paul was the Ritz's deputy head of security. He had worked at the hotel for years, knew the building well, and understood how its entrances, exits, and security arrangements worked. His occasional contact with French intelligence would later attract attention, leading some people to question whether there was more to his role. That evening, Diana and Dodi returned to the hotel. Dodi reportedly showed interest in a ring, which later fueled speculation that he might have been considering an engagement. But whatever plans the couple may have had, they were still dealing with one major problem: the photographers outside. A planned dinner was eventually cancelled because the paparazzi presence made leaving the hotel too risky. Instead, they remained at the Ritz. Then another unusual detail emerged. Henri Paul had already finished his shift, yet he was called back to the hotel. Security footage later showed him returning after being away for several hours. As the evening wore on, Dodi reportedly decided to leave the Ritz and return to his Paris apartment. But only a small number of people were told about the change in plans. Henri Paul was one of them. And that decision created an entirely new problem. How could Diana and Dodi leave the heavily watched hotel without the photographers realizing where they were going? The answer would involve a carefully planned escape through the back of the Ritz. And within hours, that escape plan would become part of one of the most examined nights in modern history. So, Diana had become uncomfortable with the growing pressure from the paparazzi and wanted a way to leave without being followed. But did their escape plan actually work? Or did the photographers manage to figure out where they were going? Let's find out. A decoy plan that ended inside the tunnel. This is where the tension reportedly reached its highest point. The entrance of the Ritz was already crowded with photographers, and everyone knew that taking Diana and Dodi out through the usual route would immediately attract attention. If the couple wanted to leave safely, they needed to make the photographers look in the wrong direction. So, the security team came up with a simple but risky plan. They would use decoy vehicles. The plan was to send a decoy vehicle through the front, while Diana and Dodi quietly left through the rear. Henri Paul would drive the Mercedes carrying them, and Trevor Rees-Jones. The plan required careful timing. Staff moved around the hotel, drivers were briefed, and Henri Paul was seen speaking with photographers and other members of the security team. Every movement mattered, because one mistake could reveal the entire plan. Eventually, Diana and Dodi left their suite. They used the service elevator and made their way toward the rear entrance. Diana reportedly did not appear frightened or distressed. She smiled, interacted with those around her, and even made a playful gesture toward Henri Paul. It was an ordinary moment. Nobody standing there knew they were watching one of Diana's final moments before the crash. The Mercedes pulled away from the Ritz. For a few precious moments, the plan appeared to work. Some photographers followed the wrong vehicles, giving Diana and Dodi a small head start, but the deception did not last. The photographers soon realized that the couple had escaped through the rear entrance. Motorcycles started moving. Cars followed. The chase was underway. Henri Paul accelerated through the streets of Paris as the photographers tried to keep up, but the route ahead was not as straightforward as expected. Traffic and road conditions forced changes to the original plan, and the Mercedes took a different path. Instead of escaping through the intended route, the car continued toward the river. And ahead was the Alma tunnel. Despite Diana and Dodi's attempt to escape the paparazzi, photographers continued following them, eventually forcing their journey into the Alma tunnel. But could they finally escape through the tunnel? Or was something far more tragic waiting for them on the other side? Let's uncover the emotional details. The crash in the Alma tunnel. Now, this is where the entire story took its darkest turn. The Mercedes entered the Alma tunnel at an extremely high speed. Within moments, the car lost control, struck the wall, crossed the roadway, and slammed into the tunnel's 13th pillar with tremendous force. The impact was catastrophic. Henri Paul and Dodi Al-Fayed died at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones survived, although he suffered terrible injuries. Diana, however, was still alive inside the wreckage. Emergency workers rushed toward the Mercedes and immediately began trying to save her. But as investigators examined the crash scene, another detail quickly attracted attention. There appeared to be evidence that the Mercedes had come into contact with a white Fiat Uno. Parts believed to belong to the Fiat were found inside the tunnel, while white paint appeared on the Mercedes. The discovery raised a major question. Had another vehicle been involved? The possibility continued to fuel speculation for years. A damaged white Fiat was later linked to photographer James Anderson, whose name became connected to the investigation. However, investigators never established that he had deliberately caused the collision or that the Fiat was part of a planned attack. While those questions were developing, Diana was fighting for her life. A doctor who happened to come across the wreck reportedly rushed to help before the emergency team arrived. Paramedics then took over, working desperately to stabilize Diana at the scene and during the journey to hospital. The hospital was only a few miles away, but the Yaman Hajim ambulance did not simply race there. French emergency procedures required medics to treat Diana en route, trying to stabilize her worsening condition. Eventually, she reached the hospital. Doctors fought to save her, but despite their efforts, Diana could not be revived. When the news finally reached the outside world, the shock was overwhelming. Princess Diana was dead. A journey that had begun as a private escape from the photographers had ended in one of the most heartbreaking tragedies the world had ever witnessed. Here's what happened. Henri Paul was driving Diana and Dodi when their Mercedes entered the Alma tunnel and crashed, claiming the lives of all but one of the occupants. But what mystery surrounding the accident refused to go away? And what did investigators eventually discover that made the case even more complicated? Let's find out. The complicated DNA evidence. This is where the investigation took another fascinating turn. One of the biggest questions surrounding the crash focused on Henri Paul and the condition he was in when he got behind the wheel. French testing showed Henri Paul had a high blood alcohol level, leading investigators to conclude he was heavily intoxicated while driving the Mercedes. For many, this offered a straightforward explanation for the crash, but not everyone accepted that conclusion. Some questioned whether the tested blood actually belonged to Henri Paul, while others suggested the sample may have been switched to make him appear intoxicated. If the blood had belonged to someone else, then one of the most important pieces of evidence against Paul would immediately come under question. So investigators needed to establish something very basic before the argument could go any further. Whose blood had actually been tested? To answer that question, DNA testing was carried out on the disputed blood samples. Investigators then compared the DNA results with samples obtained from Henri Paul's parents. The DNA result was significant. It reportedly matched Henri Paul, confirming the blood belonged to him, and weakening claims that someone had secretly replaced his sample with another person's to make him appear intoxicated. In other words, the issue was no longer simply about what the alcohol test showed. Investigators had also addressed whether the sample itself could be trusted. But even that finding did not bring every mystery to an end. Questions remained about Paul's behavior earlier that evening. Security footage from the Ritz showed him walking around without appearing obviously impaired to some viewers. He was also seen returning to the hotel after being away for several hours, raising questions about where he had been and what had happened during that gap. And then there was the most important question of all. What happened during those final minutes between the Ritz and the moment the Mercedes entered the Alma tunnel? The DNA evidence answered one specific question. It did not answer everything. The DNA testing confirmed that the blood samples belonged to Henri Paul, supporting the finding that he was intoxicated while driving Diana and Dodi. But does that completely clear the royal family of any connection to the tragedy? Or did the investigation itself leave behind questions that could not be ignored? Let's dive into the contradictory details. Lord Stephen's investigation. Now, this is where the police investigation became more complicated. When Lord Stephens took charge of Operation Paget, his team was not simply trying to explain why the Mercedes crashed. They also had to examine one of the most disturbing possibilities surrounding Diana's death. Had she and Dodi been deliberately targeted? Investigators went through the available evidence piece by piece. They examined the crash itself, Henri Paul's background and movements, the paparazzi who followed the couple, possible intelligence connections, the mysterious white Fiat Uno, and the claims that people connected to the royal family or British intelligence could have been involved. After an extensive investigation, Operation Paget found no evidence of a planned assassination and no proof of a conspiracy to kill Diana and Dodi. For many people, that should have settled the matter. But during the later British inquest, even parts of Stephen's own investigation came under closer examination. Attention turned to a conversation Stephens had reportedly held with Henri Paul's parents in Paris. During that meeting, he was said to have suggested that their son would not be blamed for driving while under the influence. Then the official report appeared to say something very different. It concluded that Henri Paul had been significantly over the legal alcohol limit when he drove the Mercedes. That apparent contradiction immediately created another uncomfortable question. Why had Paul's parents apparently been given one impression only for the final report to reach another? Conclusion? The coroner later presented several possible explanations. Perhaps Stephens had not known exactly what the completed report would contain at the time of the meeting. Perhaps he had been trying to comfort grieving parents who had just lost their son. Or perhaps something had changed between that conversation and the final report. There was no simple answer. Whatever the explanation, the issue became another point for the jury to examine carefully. And it highlighted something important. So, investigators found no evidence of a conspiracy, yet people still wanted to understand how every major conclusion had been reached. But could some of the concerns surrounding Diana's death have been genuine and worth examining? Now, let's dive into the evidence that raised more questions. The replay of Diana's final moments. This is where the world's attention returned to Diana's final hours, and the footage made the tragedy feel painfully real. Years after the crash, the British inquest carefully examined security footage from the Ritz Hotel. The cameras captured Diana and Dodi before they left, moving through the hotel as they prepared for the night ahead. They looked calm. There was no obvious sign of fear or panic. Nothing in their expressions suggested that they knew they were heading toward danger. The jury examined Henri Paul's behavior. Despite blood tests showing high alcohol levels, hotel footage showed him walking normally, moving confidently, and even bending down to tie his shoes. That difference naturally attracted attention. But the jury was warned not to judge someone's condition simply by watching them walk. They had to consider the medical evidence, the blood testing, and the circumstances surrounding the results before reaching any conclusion. Then there were the paparazzi. Their role became another major part of the investigation. Had the intense pursuit of Diana and Dodi created the dangerous situation that eventually led to the crash? The jury considered Diana's safety concerns, the possibility of another vehicle, and Mohammed Al-Fayed's belief that Diana and his son were deliberately killed.
Already, Lord Mitcham have put a complaint saying exactly what's going to happen to her, that she's going to be murdered in a car, and nobody done nothing.
But the court had to separate what could be proven from what was simply alleged. The inquest also examined claims that Diana was pregnant or preparing to become engaged to Dodi. Medical evidence presented during the hearings did not support the pregnancy claim. Yet perhaps the hardest evidence to watch was the simplest. Diana and Dodi were seen holding hands. She was smiling. They looked like two people enjoying an ordinary evening. Within hours, their lives would be changed forever, and the jury had to reconstruct every moment that led them from that peaceful hotel to the tragedy inside the Alma tunnel. So, the footage showed Diana and Dodi appearing calm during their final hours, while Henri Paul looked steady despite later evidence showing he had been drinking. But what should we really believe about Diana's final moments? Could the available facts finally outweigh the rumors and conspiracy theories? Let's uncover the intriguing details. The official explanation of the crash. By the end of the investigation, the search for answers had stretched across years of evidence, testimony, competing theories, and public suspicion. Investigators returned to the Alma tunnel. They examined Henri Paul's condition, his movements, and the circumstances surrounding his decision to drive. They studied the paparazzi pursuit, investigated the mysterious white Fiat Uno, and tested disputed blood samples through DNA analysis. Even Lord Stephen's Operation Paget was later examined during the British inquest. Diana's final hours were also carefully reconstructed through photographs, CCTV footage, witness accounts, and other available evidence. Piece by piece, investigators tried to rebuild that night, and after all those years of examination, the evidence did not establish that Diana had been deliberately assassinated or that a conspiracy had been proven. Instead, it presented a far more complicated picture: a Mercedes traveling at high speed, a driver whose blood contained a level of alcohol far above the legal limit, a relentless paparazzi pursuit, a last-minute change of plans, and a series of decisions that eventually brought the car into the Alma tunnel. For some people, that explanation was enough. For others, it never completely settled the matter, and perhaps that is why Diana's final night remains so difficult to discuss, even decades later. Because Diana was never simply another member of the royal family. Millions of people had watched her grow from a young woman struggling to understand royal life into someone who appeared increasingly confident, independent, and determined to build a life of her own. They watched her experience heartbreak. They watched her find causes she cared deeply about. They watched her laugh again. And by the summer of 1997, many believed she had finally discovered a new sense of freedom and happiness. Then, suddenly, everything ended. That is what makes the final images so haunting. Diana had entered the Ritz that evening, appearing calm. She smiled. She interacted with the people around her. She had no reason to believe that the journey waiting outside would become her last. Investigators could examine the evidence. They could challenge conspiracy theories and explain the conclusions they reached. But no investigation could undo the loss. And perhaps the most haunting truth is that Diana walked into that final journey without knowing where it would lead. So, what do you think about the head of police's revelation? Could there have been more to the story? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.